This is my story. This is my song. Praising my Savior all the day long. If you are a returning guest of ours here on the Accessible God podcast, you will recognize that we have started playing an intro song that is a variation of that beautiful, beautiful song written by Fanny Crosby, who herself was indeed a disabled person. How many of you all knew that Fanny Crosby was disabled? Jonathan, did you know that?
I did know that.
And our guest today, Justin, did you know that?
I did know that. I'm married to a hymnologist, so that's kind of a requirement.
Yes, that's awesome. And as I said, we have this new intro song that we've been using. We want to thank fellow United Methodist deacon Andrew Labar Dietz out of the Virginia Conference, who has put that together for us. He's a good friend of ours, a good friend of the AGP, and has created that for us. So, welcome back to another episode of the Accessible God podcast. I'm your host, Reverend Hank Jenkins, along with my co-host, the Reverend Jonathan Campbell. And today is a very special day. We have with us, for the first time ever, a guest here on the show. And that is the Reverend Justin Hancock, a fellow deacon. Justin, does it feel amazing to be the very first guest on the Accessible God podcast?
You know, there are two things that I didn't know heading into this podcast. I didn't know, number one, that Hank was gonna sing me in, which is just absolutely awesome. And I didn't know, number two, that I was the first guest, which means, fellas, it can only go down or up from here. I guess the decision is entirely up to you and your audience. But no, it feels great to be here, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I'm going to be an optimist and say this is going to be an amazing episode,
Yes.
and so it can only go down from here.
Yes.
Oh goodness! Well, thanks for having me, guys.
Well, yeah, we're glad that you're here, Justin. And Jonathan, I want to check in with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited about our first guest and excited for all the wisdom he's going to bring to us. So,
Yeah. And speaking of wisdom, the past couple of episodes, Jonathan and I have started out with a little segment called "What Not to Say to a Disabled Person." And a variation of that would be ways not to act towards a disabled person. So we want to ask our guest for this episode, Justin, what is something somebody should not say or ways that people should not act towards a disabled person? How would you answer that?
Well, you know, it's funny. I was tossing this question around my dinner table with my wife because, in addition to being a musician, she's a PhD in disability theology and co-founder of our organization, the Julian Way. So this is kind of what we do for a living. And guys, I gotta tell you, when I started to dive into this question this morning, there's so much. Um, but I think the top two that we came up with is some variation of, don't worry, when you get to heaven, you're going to walk, move, or be mobile just fine.
Yes.
And or my personal favorite, because it's the one that I hear most. I used to hear what's wrong with you, but thankfully, uh, dialogue and conversation has progressed enough that we rarely get what's wrong with you. But so the one that I hear most that always makes me squirmy is some variation of, well, we all have disabilities. It's just a matter of degree.
Yeah.
So those would be my top two choices, but sadly, it's not as in short supply as we might hope. So
And how do you respond to those questions or those comments?
Well, the first one, the when you get to heaven, you'll be mobile or walk just fine, is probably the one that I am most equipped to handle gracefully. I usually just say, God and I have talked and had many conversations. And if God wants to physically cure me, I'm not going to say no, but God is sort of fine with where I am. And I love where I am. Thank you so much for caring about me. When I don't want to be a jackass, hopefully that's how I approach that question.
Let me ask you something, Justin. How long did it take you to get to a place where you could be that graceful?
It took a long time, and to be honest, there are times when you can physically see my face trying to work through and up to that process.
Yeah.
The second one, we're all just disabled, it's just a matter of degree. I usually just say yes and thank you, because I don't have 45 minutes to tell you how egregious that is. So yeah, it varies. So, I mean, depending on what day you catch me, you're liable to get a much more ornery answer either one of those queries.
You mean disabled people can be grumpy? I'm shocked.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you catch me on the wrong day, and you'll catch Grumpy Hank, definitely, or say a variation of those things on the wrong day to me, and you'll get Grumpy Hank.
Yeah.
Well, Justin, thank you for answering that question, and once again, thank you for joining us today and being with us today. Let's start out by talking a little bit about you, Justin. As I've already said, you are an ordained deacon in the United Methodist Church. You are out of the North Texas Conference, and your primary ministry is with an organization called the Julian Way. Is that correct?
Excuse me. Yes, that is correct. That's an organization my wife and I co-founded, and I've been doing that more or less full time for between 5 and 6 years. I just passed my first full year of doing it absolutely full time as my only exclusive appointment. So yeah, but that's my work, and excited to share a little bit about that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about kind of the mission of the Julian Way? What is some of the work that you do there with that organization? And just how that ministry works itself out.
Yeah, so the primary mission of the Julian Way is based around the theology and teaching from Julian of Norwich, a 15th century English mystic, and she had a very profound spiritual experience when she was basically on her deathbed. And one of the teachings that came out of that experience is that all of God's creation is God's good creation. And that's really our founding principle and driving tenet. And the way that manifests itself is we take the view that doing ministry with, for, and by persons with disabilities, or as we like to say, diverse embodiments, includes journeying with people to discover the ways in which their unique physical and developmental embodiment calls them into relationship with God, and the ways that God views their unique embodiment as an asset and a mark of diversity, and not really as a mistake or something even to be overcome. And we do that primarily in two ways. One is through walking with people in individual spiritual direction and discipleship relationships to help them discover their own calling and place in the kingdom of God. And two is teaching and advocacy within religious and civic spaces about creating a culture of equity and accessibility throughout God's world. And that takes a number of forms. That's speaking engagements, that's video blogs, that's justice work, that's a comedy and social justice. Yes, those two things can coexist. Podcast that we just started this year. So we do a number of things in the advocacy and justice and teaching space as well. So yeah, but it's right now all self-funded, and I've been very blessed to wake up every morning and do it for a living. I love what I do and am challenged every day to do it more effectively, and so far it's been a dream. So yeah.
So if people wanted to support what you're doing, learn more, could you give us the contact information?
Yes, if people wanted to support us, we have a website. We are at the julianway.org is our website, and you can find our blogs on the website. I do a weekly or sometimes twice weekly blog. If there's an issue or an advocacy topic that really strikes my interest. So you can find our blogs there. You can find a way to get a copy of my book, a way to book my wife and I and our organization to come in and do church disability assessment work. And we're currently building a place for our podcast to live on the website as well. But yeah, our website is thejulianway.org, as I said, and there's a donate link on that as well. We also have an active Twitter and Facebook page. I would have laughed at you 7 years ago if you had told me I would exist on social media in the way that I do now, but you never know what muscles God is going to call you to stretch in this line of work. Yeah.
Justin, go ahead, Jonathan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm just, I'm sure that our audience, I know I'm curious. Would you mind giving us kind of a brief overview of your story? How'd you get from how did you get from a place where you were very angry when people said the beginning comments you made about, going to heaven, that kind of stuff. How did you get from being angry about that? How did you process that? And how did you come to be doing the work you're doing? What's your journey? What was it involved?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I had the privilege, and I now recognize it as an immense privilege, to have a really great upbringing and a really stable home, where my disability was never hidden and never dismissed. My parents were in the legal profession and in special education, and an elementary school principal for a number of years. So my disability was always respected, but both of my brothers were able-bodied, and all of my friends, except for a 2-week window at summer camp, were mostly able-bodied. So I grew up going and doing everything that everyone else did, and I knew that I was quote unquote experienced cerebral palsy and had what would be called a disability. But it wasn't until I got older and high school into college and even into graduate school, and that really I really began to understand what a disability really was in the world and how society viewed it, and how I got to where I am now is I was doing college ministry just after being ordained. I still love college ministry, and we had moved back to Dallas. I had married my now wife, and she was going to start seminary at Perkins to pursue her graduate education. And through our early married life, we dealt off and on with social services and how isolating and dehumanizing the government interface with disability is and can be. And that was really the awakening of, okay, what does a community-centered, Christ-centered approach have to say to the loneliness of disability? So my wife and I were having bagels and began to pray about that and began to say, okay, we're experiencing a dawning comprehension of just how different a family we really are. So we came up with really what was an intentional community approach, or a sort of a neo-monastic approach to, asking people to share their disability stories with us and inviting people to share those stories with us and being community with them. But it was really this dawning realization as I began to feel called to minister to fellow people with a disability that there was this whole subculture and this whole civil rights movement. I told the story. I have a book, The Julian Way, A Theology of Fullness, which kind of tells the story of both the way that churches interacted historically with people with disabilities and the way our larger culture has. And it wasn't until I was researching that book and I went, holy mackerel, I didn't know everything that went into the ADA and how contentious it was, and the messy history of resistance because of HIV, AIDS, and a number of different issues. And that was really my own awakening.
Yeah.
To that situation.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Justin. I didn't mean to run over you there, but there are so many people who don't know the history of the ADA, but they also don't realize how much the church, and I say the church just broadly, the church really fought back against the ADA and fought not to be included in the ADA, right? And there's just really a sad history there of how the church in general reacted to disabled rights, right? Am I correct?
Yeah. Yes, and as a matter of fact, I profile a case in the back half of my book, the Hosanna Tabor case, that I think met its final resolution in 2012. and the woman that sued the Lutheran school where she was working due to her narcolepsy, and a situation arising from that, lost in the Supreme Court because of the ministerial exemption. And the church, the Lutheran, Missouri Synod Lutheran school she was working for, classifying her as clergy. So there's been this sort of undercurrent of resistance to ADA and of exclusion that has really existed in the church for a long time. While it must be said, there have been plenty of churches who have taken incremental steps forward. So it's really a complicated and subtle and not so subtle picture simultaneously. So yeah.
As someone who, like you, cares deeply about social justice, has been active in social justice stuff, I'd love to get your thoughts about another thing I don't think most people, able-bodied people, don't realize is in the disabled community around social justice issues, the people that fight for social change in the disability community really view the church as enemy number one, or if not enemy number one, close. So
yeah.
do you mind speaking to that reality and how you navigate it?
Yes, I will do my best, and sometimes the answer to that question in brief is sometimes I navigate it well, and mostly that involves just ignoring it and doing whatever the hell I think God is calling me to do anyway, and then going to the church and going, whoops, we're already here. Oopsie.
And that's that speaks to so much of great social justice work. But go ahead.
Yeah, I really think there is a lot to be said around. Well, one of the things I say in my book, when we get to the theological writings and that we address in the book, is I take several theologians straight on. I take Augustine on. I take on Friedrich Schleiermacher, which it needs to be said I will never ever do again. And what I try to demonstrate in all of the theologians we address is that when we do theology out of context, and when we don't allow our theology to grow and evolve and change and meet the people where they are, we get stuck in doctrines that do folks with disability much, much more harm than good. And what I mean by that is, and why I think the church is often perceived as enemy number one, is the vast majority of churches that I have ever been a part of come to disability in one form or another, and they want to problematize the situation, and they want to get me as the disabled person beyond my disability. And for me, my embodiment, my cerebral palsy, is not only a part of who I am, it is absolutely integral to who I am. So when you first meet me as a religious person and a person of faith, and you problematize my cerebral palsy, you problematize the very marrow of who I am.
They problematize your identity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I just think we're getting there as a church. We're beginning to understand different ways to view that, but boy, we've got a lot of baggage to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Jonathan and I have, both of us do advocacy work within the church, as well as our audience knows, and have given talks to different times. And me personally, whenever I give a talk about disability issues and disability theology in the church, I won't start that talk without starting about disability culture and like understanding disability culture within society, because there's truly not an understanding, definitely not within the
Yeah.
church, but in society at large, about what disability culture is, or what the lived experience of disability is really like. And that was honestly, for me, one of the great things about your book. And I'm going to hold Justin's book up here to my video for those of you who enjoy our podcast on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on a regular podcast, if you have somebody who maybe is part of the deaf community or hard of hearing, they can participate in the podcast on YouTube. So closed captioning is available. But this is Justin's book. It's called The Julian Way, a theology of fullness for all God's people. But your first chapter within this book, Justin, you really, I think, do a tremendous job of looking at what are called the models of disability. And this is a starting point, I think, for whether it's disability theology, disability understanding, disability culture, is really starting with the models of disability. And you walk through 5 models of disability that are talked about. Do you want to talk a little bit about those and what you say in the book about them?
Yes. So the models of disability really is the first revelation for me as a person who was entering into the advocacy of the disability or diversely embodied advocacy space, because I grew up thinking that the medical model, which is essentially it is the first model covered in the book, but the medical model is the model that if you ask 95 people on the street, probably 93 of them are going to give you some definition of a medical model definition of disability, I should say. And that clearly and concisely stated is the attitude or the model that disability is a medical condition, and that there are a series of medical treatments or remedies or interventions that can be administered to help somebody move from a disabled state to a more quote unquote normal or able-bodied state. And then I move in the book to the model that was really the first attempt by persons with disabilities to begin to craft their self-definition, and that is the social model of disability. Excuse me. I just taught my own book about 3 weeks ago, and when I'm immersed in it for 6 weeks, I tend to take about 3 weeks off after I get done and kind of do a deep cleanse. So the social model of disability was really in the mid 1970s, coming out of the civil rights movement and based around the civil rights movement. A group of disabled social theorists began to say, no, the conditions, cerebral palsy, MS, other things like that, being paralyzed, being quadriplegia, those are impairments.
Right.
But a condition becomes disabling when you're met by the physical or attitudinal barriers out in society. That's when impairments transform into disabilities. And then we talk about the moral model, which is basically what we find in a lot of churches, even if it's the undercurrent in a lot of churches, and nobody would ever really, I hope, openly do this, and sometimes that makes it more insidious, is that disability is a result of a moral problem or a sin or some moral deficiency. That's the moral model, and that's where you get a lot of the evangelical healing teachings coming out and the problematizing of disability from a religious perspective. Honestly, if I wrote the book now, I'm not sure I would include the moral model as a distinct category.
Oh,
because
really? Why is that?
Well, because it is so pervasive and so subtle that I don't think the way I frame it as its own individual distinct category that you can go around or avoid makes a lot of sense. I think there are, go ahead.
Well, and especially after reading your book, I kind of think of the moral model as an extension of the medical model, but whereas the medical model says there's something wrong with your body and we need to fix it through medicine or science, the moral model says there's something wrong with your body and we need to fix it through prayer, or we need to fix it through you stop sinning, or you stop healing, and we're going to pray over you.
Yeah, to be honest, I feel like they feed off each other. You know, that they basically justify one another. You know, that there is a problem. We can either fix it with medical cures or we can fix it with spiritual cures, but we've got to fix it.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we talk about the limit model, which was developed by Deborah Beth Creamer when she was at ILIF, and basically that says that I feel my disabilities more on days when conditions exist where the arthritis for me in my hands or my hips is more or less prevalent or noticeable, so that again allows room for disability to at least exist on a spectrum.
But I want to ask a
go ahead.
Well, and you hinted at this earlier about there being something problematic about people saying everyone is disabled, right? And we see that sometimes comes about through the limits model of disability. Is that correct?
Yes, that's really the main criticism or the main issue I take with the limits model in the book and throughout our teaching, is that the limits model can create an environment where one could seek to pass, or it frames being less disabled as somehow more desirable, and it simultaneously can water down the disabled experience or not allow someone or not allow conversations to occur where we get to know the uniqueness of everybody's disabled experience, because we're all still trying to reach a normal, it's still functioning on a normal versus abnormal binary. And the reason we end with the cultural model is we think the cultural model of disability seeks to create the largest, I should say, tent possible for everyone's disability experience, to be unique and to bring something to the table and not be on a hierarchy of disability. Well, I'm more disabled than you are, so
Yeah.
I deserve a better seat at the table. And the reason we use the cultural model is it allows the conversation around disability to be more positive, and it's really informed my work, because if you claim disability and you want to like operate within that label, tell me your story and tell me why you're drawn to that. I'm not here to judge who is and who is not disabled necessarily.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And we've had this talk before that sometimes identifying yourself as disabled is a hard thing for people to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There are some people who really struggle with identifying as disabled because historically the term disability has such a negative connotation, which Jonathan and I have talked about is something that I fight to eradicate, is like getting the negative out of disability, because I think it's a part of having a human body is the chance that you could be disabled.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me ask you. We have people here that listen to us that are pastors, who are people that are active in a church. What would you say to a pastor or a church that basically said, I want to become more of a welcoming place for people with disabilities? Where do I start?
That's a very interesting question, because there are about 7 answers to that single inquiry, right? But I think the thing that you start with is being willing to admit what you don't know. The number one thing I tell congregations out of the box is, if we want to be more accessible, what do we do? Because I always get some variation of, usually it's, so what do we call you? Like, how do we address your disability?
Yeah.
And I always say, well, let's start with my name. And then you let me, as the person experiencing cerebral palsy, guide the conversation. And for a lot of pastors, that can be scary, and church leaders, that can be scary. But I find in most cases, if you approach a person with a disability saying, we want to be more open and more universally accessible or inclusive of persons with disabilities, would you help us understand what you need and how we can do that authentically? If you ask a question like that, I'm guaranteeing you that 99 out of 100 times you're gonna get somebody that's on board with you. So number one is admit what you don't know. The inverse of that is don't assume that you know what someone needs. Offer them a program or a chance to interact with a solution that you put in place, and then when they kind of roll their eyes or don't meet your expectations, throw your hands up and then go, well, I tried. Obviously, if people with disabilities wanted to be here, they would be here, and then we would have the programs for them. Or so, yeah. But those are two sides of really the same coin. Is that what you were after?
Yeah, I also, in my experience, and mine is much more limited than yours, when I've worked with churches or been asked to work with churches to help them engage with the disability community, it usually has begun because a beloved parishioner in their congregation has either developed a disability or a child that they care deeply about has a disability. How do you help a church take it from, yes, it is wonderful that you want to accommodate Ed or Sally, but how do you help them start to see a wider vision of actually engaging the community and not just meeting the needs of the person they care about?
I think that's where, and that's what we try to do with when we do studies of our book, is we try our best to create a picture or to craft a reality where folks with disabilities aren't this great extra that it would be wonderful if you would accommodate. We try to allow people to experience a reality where folks with disabilities, something is missing if we're not here. There is a unique perspective on God's reality that churches do not have access to when we don't work to not only include people with disabilities in our services and such, but when we don't integrate the experience of people with disabilities into the very fabric of who we are. I always say, as a speaker and teacher and pastor, that I can tell where you are and how seriously you are about inviting folks with disability into the church in about 3 seconds. All I need to do is look at the way your pulpit and chancel are set up.
Right.
And the way your room is positioned, because that who you give access to the leadership structures and the leadership spaces tells me everything about where your church wants or desires to be.
Right. Right. Justin, can you talk just briefly, real quick, about your experience of being a minister with a disability in the church, and you've had various ministries throughout the year, but how have you been accepted or not accepted, or maybe welcomed or not welcomed within the church as a minister with a disability?
I think the frame of reference for me being accepted or not accepted in the church as a minister with a disability is ever changing and ever shifting. I would say that my experience has been a lot smoother than a lot of other people's. I've, in my work with the Julian Way, heard horror story after horror story dealing with, for us in the Methodist Church, committees on ordained ministry, and for other bodies, whatever their adjudicatory system is, or a qualification system is. I did not have that problem. I honestly had a great experience throughout my ordination. People have always, for the most part, been very supportive of me and my ministry. I think what concerns me most now as a minister with a disability, and what I push on my colleagues most to work on, is I think there's an expectation that you bring in the disabled person to preach or teach the special Sunday.
Yeah.
And you may pay them or you may not pay them. I think the issue of our times as people who want to work and have jobs and do vital ministries as people with disabilities is compensation. Because I think too often pro bono work is sort of assumed.
Yeah.
And the other kind of thing that I face on an almost daily basis, maybe not with myself, but with others that I journey with, is that people who I know are qualified are stopped at the gates before they even get the opportunity because they are visibly disabled, and then they are either recommended for hospital chaplaincy if it's an optimistic situation, or some sort of disability ministry. And I can't tell you the number of conversations I have with colleagues from other denominations and even in the Methodist Church, like, I don't want to do disability ministry. Not that I don't respect other people with disabilities, but I have pure and many, many gifts for ministry beyond my disabled experience. So
You don't want to be pigeonholed in disability ministry just because you're disabled.
no, and honestly, that's why, I mean, God and I always, nip and pick at one another. God is very tolerant of me. But it took me a while to accept the calling to the Julian Way, because it was like, God, are you sure? Am I not just going to be the disabled guy who is annoying and a problem? And God finally said, I'll never forget it, sort of our inciting incident was at a talk where a well-known theologian who's, if I say the name, people are going to know it. So I'm not going to say their name.
We'll just have to guess.
Maybe in the bonus features of the podcast.
Yeah, we could. That's our gimmick for the Patreon account. Is our guests will name names if you pay us money.
Okay, you got me. I'm not gonna name the name, but it rhymes. It rhymes with family Marwas.
Wow.
That's an inside joke for anybody that doesn't know a lot of theology, because we all know who it is now.
Yeah.
Got up in front of a room full of disabled folks and said, it is the church's job to tell the story of people with disabilities because they can't tell their own story. And 9 of us, several of you are listening to this podcast and can back me up on this. 9 of us rolled out of the room because we were like, well, screw this.
Well, what are we doing here? Yeah, I respect that theologian a lot, but I've heard that story on a couple of occasions.
I do too, and boy, I wrote that chapter of the book on a really ornery day as well. I'll just leave it at that. I don't even remember the original question. That's what that story does to me. See?
I was just talking about being a minister with a disability and just that experience. So I appreciate your answer.
And I'd like you to speak to jumping off that experience, not to jump more on that theologian, but to jump more on that experience. I don't think people realize, I don't think able-bodied folks, I should say, realize how much damage paternalism does to us.
Yeah.
So could you speak to that? Because I think a lot of able-bodied people see it as a good thing. They want to help take care of, and I don't think they see the coercive force of paternalism. So could you speak to that coercive force?
Yeah. Well, it's the number one thing that I tell folks, uh, whether it's a disabled audience or an able-bodied audience, is raise your own expectations for us. And I think that paternalism and that forceful, I want to care for you, without sort of blindly and without understanding an individual's story or individual's journey, you've automatically um, undercut somebody and limited the power that they have to craft their own narrative and forge and find their own God-given way of articulating what God is calling them to do. And so I think that sort of paternalism and protection and ableism is really a a danger, because it doesn't allow for us to, you know, power is everything, right? The power to craft one's own narrative, the power to have your own voice and really utilize your own power is everything. And when someone just sort of blithely says, I want to care for you, and I want to do it in such a way that makes sure you don't hurt yourself, is destructive, because um, it really limits what a person can do. Now that having been said, even as I say that the number one thing I say to groups is raise your own expectations for us, I've had to learn the nuance of that statement and the evolving power behind how to use language, even in the last year, because I've been deeply influenced by folks like Ibram Kendi and his books, particularly How to Be an Anti-Racist, when he says, when we talk about power and how folks should conform to a certain standard, or be more articulate, or even, as I say, raise your own expectations for us, I want to be very careful that I don't then take some sort of artificial high expectations that the able-bodied community sets for the world and hand that to disabled folks and say, here, you hold this. It is your responsibility to be the articulate, upstanding, disabled individual, if that makes sense.
No.
Right. Well, and it's just that understanding of raise your expectations, but also don't understand that the able-bodied individual is not the standard barrier of what expectations should be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is 100% right.
Justin, we only have a couple more minutes, but I want to take this last little bit. You mentioned it early on, your podcast. I just want to allow you a little bit to plug that podcast and tell people about what it is. You have a podcast that you co-host called Palsies with Palsy. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes. That is the podcast that has been in the works for a while, and me and my co-host are not only best friends, she used to live in community with us. And the way we build this podcast is, come see what it was like talking to us around our kitchen table. And we tend to take on social justice issues through the lens of pop culture and disability, and my co-host is a member of the LGBTQ community. Her wife is a pastor in the Mountain Sky Conference. So we always, sometimes it's an hour on the disability and queer experience of transgender rights, and sometimes it's why do we love Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons, and how did these pop culture things we love so much interact in both queer spaces and disability spaces. So we try to create a little bit of joy, take on serious justice related topics with a sense of humor, but really give our audience and ourselves an opportunity to express the disabled life and LGBTQ and queer life as 360-degree real people, having funny and challenging conversations. So we would love for your audience to come to check out Palsies with Palsies. I don't know about y'all, but we tend to function a little bit more liberally with the explicit tag. So our conversations are never rude, but they're never, we're not very gentle. We're very honest in the things that we talk about. So, and not to say that y'all are not, but just fair warning to anyone that might come along. But we'd love to have you come check us out.
Yeah, and it's a great podcast. Their latest episode deals with the issues of sex and relationships and disability, and it's a fun listen. It talks the first part of it especially talks a lot about purity culture and the damages of that, and sex and disability, which is a great topic. So
yeah, Justin, as a person with cerebral palsy, I'm a little offended I haven't been invited on.
Well, that's a funny story, because now that I've been on your podcast, you are completely obligated to reciprocate and come on to my podcast. So we will get that up and running, I assure you, sir.
Okay.
That'll be great. Well, Justin, we thank you for being our guest, our first guest, and a wonderful guest here on the Accessible God
we
podcast.
Need to send him a trophy or something that says first guest.
First guest, or maybe like make him a personalized T-shirt that says "I was the first guest on the Accessible God podcast."
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Justin, thank you for your time. Thank you for this wonderful information and this wonderful conversation. As always, as he said, that if you want to learn more about Justin and the work he's doing, you can go to his website, julianway.org or julianway.org, or you can pick up his book, The Julian Way, A Theology of Fullness for All of God's People. And Justin is doing wonderful work with that organization. As always, here on the Accessible God podcast, we thank you for being our guest. We thank you for listening with us. If you want to know more about the work that we do, or another way to listen to the podcast, you can find us on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Ministers with Disabilities, or you can find us on Twitter. That tag is AMD_UMC, or you can also find us on Instagram, AMD.UMC, or also find us on Facebook. We hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time. Oh, let me stop this. Sorry.